We hear a lot about climate change and the science that proves it, but has anybody checked the findings?
Basically, it's circular reasoning. I'm saying they don't have any good reason to think that this theory is correct, even if you believe the millions of years are real.
We'll examine an error in the science upon which the claims concerning climate change rest. Today on Weekend Connection. I'm Vic Gregory, and let's get connected. We hear about it in the halls of academia. It is being pushed in the chambers of government, and it is seeping into the thinking of believers. I'm talking about climate change and the idea that the Earth's weather patterns are being altered by human use of fossil fuels and chlorofluorocarbons. Today on Weekend Connection, we'll take a look at a little-known discrepancy that discredits much of what global warming alarmists believe. Joining me today is Dr. Jake Hebert. Dr. Hebert is a physicist and research associate with the Institute for Creation Research. He received his doctorate at the University of Texas at Dallas, where he did cutting-edge study on the connection between cosmic rays, weather, and climate. And he is the author of The Ice Age and the Flood, Does Science Really Show Millions of Years?, and The Climate Change Conflict, Keeping Cool Over Global Warming. Dr. Hebert, welcome to the Weekend Connection broadcast today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, we're certainly glad to have you as a part of our program. You previously let me know that I can refer to you as Jake, so I'll be doing that during our time together. And Jake, let's begin by discussing your role at the Institute for Creation Research. What is it that you actually do at ICR?
Most of my research has been somewhat climate-related. Spent a lot of time on the Ice Age, and particularly the supposed evidence for the secular Ice Age model. Mm-hmm. There's one particular model that they really like called the Milankovitch or astronomical theory. And if you read about this stuff, that name comes up all the time. But we've got a very strong Ice Age model in the creation science movement. We've been working on it for about 30 years, and it blows the doors off this Milankovitch theory. But I wanted to kind of see, well, what about the supposed evidence for this theory? Mm-hmm. And so I did some digging on that, and there are a number of reasons I think this is relevant for Christians. First of all, this Milankovitch theory assumes an old Earth. It assumes millions of years, and of course that contradicts Scripture. And so we need to be able to respond to this claim that they have evidence for this particular theory. A second reason that it is extremely relevant is that the Milankovitch theory is making a major contribution to climate change alarmism. And one of the things we've noticed at ICR, in fact, Dr. Larry Vardaman, who used to work here years ago, pointed out that the Milankovitch or astronomical theory is forcing secular scientists to conclude that our climate is unstable. Mm-hmm. Let me just kind of give you an overview of the theory. The theory is that over tens of thousands of years, supposedly, there are these subtle changes in Earth's orbital and rotational motions, and those changes affect the way the sunlight is falling on the Earth. So there's going to be changes in sunlight, the way it falls at different latitudes and seasons. And so they think there are certain times in the prehistoric past when you had less summer sunlight hitting those northern ice sheets, and those ice sheets grew and you got an ice age. And there would be other times where there was more summer sunlight hitting the northern high-latitude ice sheets, and they would melt and you get a warm period. And they think you have these quasi-periodic climate cycles going back millions of years. Now, one of the major problems with this theory is that these changes in sunlight are extremely tiny, and it is very difficult to see how that alone could give you an ice age or bring about major climate change. And so what we see is that the secular scientists have convinced themselves that our climate is unstable and that it has what you call a high climate sensitivity. And so they think little bitty changes like that can be amplified to produce runaway effects that could be catastrophic.
Well, I wanted to ask you something about this Milankovitch theory. You stated that secular scientists believe that there are times, according to this theory, when there has been more sun shining on polar ice caps, and that results in less ice. And there are times when there is less sunshine, and that results in more ice.
Right.
Why don't they ascribe global warming to more sunshine instead of ascribing it to fossil fuels?
Okay, well, now to be fair to them, there is a reason you might not expect it to be solar related, at least on short time scales, and that's because the energy output of the sun is pretty constant. Now, these changes that they're talking about occur over tens of thousands of years, and the changes that we would see are like year to year or day to day or month to month changes. And so I can sort of see where they're coming from when they argue that the sun would not be causing climate change. However, I still think they're wrong
Right.
because my PhD research was very much related to this issue. And I don't believe it's a coincidence that I ended up working for a man named Dr. Brian Tinsley at the University of Texas at Dallas. And I think it was the Lord's will that I ended up working for him because I think he's the guy who has actually figured out the true connection between the sun, cosmic rays, and weather and climate. And so I do think the sun is having an effect, but it's not because the total energy of the output of the sun is changing. It's more because of what we call the interplanetary magnetic field, and that's affecting the number of cosmic rays that can enter the atmosphere.
Before we go further, let's talk a little bit about what it is that secular scientists are believing versus what it is that creation scientists are believing as it pertains to Earth-changing weather pattern. For instance, what is a uniformitarian scientist, and what does such an individual believe?
Well, a uniformitarian is someone who would argue that the present is the key to the past. And so a uniformitarian would deny that something like the Genesis flood could have occurred. They would argue that the only processes that are allowed to explain Earth history are things that we see going on today. So you can't have anything catastrophic or cataclysmic. Now, a lot of them are sort of softening their position. They're willing to allow certain kinds of catastrophism, just not the biblical flood. But what we see is really the flood is what you really need to explain both the rocks and the fossils as well as the ice age. And basically we think the ice age there was an ice age, and it was caused by the Genesis flood.
But the uniformitarian scientists would say there have been several ice ages.
Oh, not just several. They believe there were ice ages hundreds of millions of years ago. And they would argue that within the last 2.6 million years, there have been 50 ice ages.
Oh, wow.
They call them glacial intervals, but that they are what most people would call an ice age in popular speech. And that's coming from this Milankovitch or astronomical theory.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that. You spent quite a bit of time repudiating that theory. Why is that significant to what the uniformitarians believe?
Well, for one thing, as I noted earlier, it is making a major contribution to climate alarmism. If you go to some of the blogs that are quote-unquote devoted to rebuking what they would call climate misinformation, some of them will admit point blank that the reason they know our climate is unstable is because the Milankovitch theory doesn't work without it. So that's making a major contribution. And the other reason is because the Milankovitch theory is routinely used to assign ages to deep seafloor sediments and ice cores. In fact, they're even using it to assign ages to cores from terrestrial cores. And they do this all the time, and there are probably hundreds, if not thousands, of secular age assignments that are tied to this Milankovitch theory. In fact, they actually use it to calibrate one particularly popular form of radioisotope dating called argon-argon dating. So this has huge implications for the debate about the age of the Earth as well.
Now, you would say that the Milankovitch theory is in fact flawed, and therefore all of this supposed idea of several ice ages over millions and millions of years is flawed. We know that to be true because of what we believe Scripture teaches, but you can look at it from a scientific standpoint and say, well, I see the flaws in the science, can't you?
Yes, and really, this is something that somebody else should have pointed out a long time ago. The reason most secular scientists believe in the Milankovitch theory is because of a paper that was published in the journal Science in 1976 called The Pacemaker of the Ice Ages. And this paper was a very big deal for the uniformitarian secular community because what they did was they analyzed chemical wiggles in two deep-sea sediment cores, and those wiggles seemed to tell a story about climate change that agreed very well with the Milankovitch theory. And so that's the reason most people nowadays believe in it. Well, I did some digging, and I found out that when they did this analysis, they had to set up preliminary timescales for those sediment cores, and it's not trivial because for the most part you can't use radioisotope dating to date seafloor sediments. Mm-hmm. So they had to use sort of a backdoor approach, and that backdoor approach was critically dependent upon the assumed age of the most recent flip of the Earth's magnetic field. Now, we creationists think those flips were caused by the Genesis flood, but they claim that they occurred hundreds of thousands of years ago. And in 1976, the age for that most recent magnetic reversal was 700,000 years, and they used that to get their results that supposedly confirmed the theory. The problem is today they claim that age is 780,000 years, and some of them would even place it as high as 790,000 years. So all I did was I said, okay, first of all, let me make sure I can replicate their results. And so I had to reconstruct the data from their papers, and I did that. Then I went back and made that age change, and I showed that it significantly messes up the results. Mm-hmm. At best, it's a coin toss, and you really don't have a statistically convincing case for the Milankovitch theory after you do that. Now, if you were to press some of these secular scientists, I think some of them would probably try to appeal to this paper that was published in 1997. But if you read between the lines, it very much looks like that second paper is an attempt to prop up the pacemaker paper. And I personally don't find it convincing at all. And, whether you find it halfway convincing, I think, depends on your bias. I would say the evidence for the theory is non-existent. I think it's almost laughable what they did, because basically, in order to get that second paper, they had to kind of repudiate the original results or the original method that was used in the pacemaker paper.
We're talking with Dr. Jake Hebert. He is a physicist and research associate with the Institute for Creation Research, and we're talking about one of the problems with the theory that much of what global warming and climate change rest upon being flawed in the way that it has been worked out. It's referred to as the Milankovitch theory. Jake, as I was watching your presentation, you referred to what is called orbital tuning, which is the method that was used to massage the numbers, so to speak, in this theory so that it all works out correctly. And I did a little research on that on the internet, and I can't claim to understand everything that I read, but it seems that secular scientists have no problems whatsoever with using this method to make all of their numbers come together. Why is that?
Well, here's what they would argue. If I were an evolutionist and if I were a uniformitarian, I might be okay with orbital tuning as long as you've got strong evidence that the Milankovitch theory is correct. Okay? Mm-hmm. The problem I have is that I'm saying they don't have that. And so even if you believe in the millions of years, the evidence for this Milankovitch theory is at best weak and at worst non-existent. Mm-hmm. So what that means is when they use this orbital tuning method, which is where they basically selectively compress and stretch different parts of the chemical signal in a core, basically it's circular reasoning. I'm saying they don't have any good reason to think that this theory is correct, even if you believe the millions of years are real. Basically, it is a train wreck for them.
Jake, we've covered a lot of information on our broadcast today, but we still have a lot of things that I think would be of interest to our listeners if we would cover that information. And so what I'd like to do is invite you to come back again next week, and we'll continue with our discussion on a biblical worldview on climate change and global warming. Would you be willing to do that with us?
Certainly.
All right. Well, we look forward to joining you again next week here on Weekend Connection.
Thank you for listening to this feature, a production of BBN, the Bible Broadcasting Network. BBN provides 24-hour Christian programming, great Christian music, and Bible teaching. Listen to BBN by clicking the link in the description.